Welcome everybody to the OFSC's webinar on excavation risk management. I'm Federal Safety Commissioner David Denney and I'll be your host today. The OFSC acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, both here in Canberra and the places you're joining us from. We acknowledge their connection to these lands and their continuing culture. You'll find all of the other OFSC safety webinars on our website, www.fsc.gov.au, including our most recent one on mental health in the building and construction industry. So if you're looking for material for your next toolbox talk, please check it out. Today's webinar is going to focus on managing excavation hazards. We picked this topic because OFSC audit data shows that a high proportion of companies are struggling to meet the OFSC's requirements for this work. For those familiar with our audit criteria, you'll know that the excavation work is covered by our hazard criteria H7. Let me give you a quick snapshot of the biggest areas of concern with H7. H7.6, which requires that excavations are regularly inspected to monitor the effectiveness of the controls in accordance with the drawings, plans or permit. We've seen non-compliance rates of about 50% with this criteria over the last 3 years. H7.5 has also been an area of concern. That requires that the excavation system ensure that where shoring or other documented methods are utilised, they are designed by a qualified engineer, detailed on up-to-date drawings, and installed and verified by a qualified person, and signed off where changes are made. The non-compliance rate with that criteria over the last 3 years has been 48.7%. The OFSC is raising corrective actions against those criteria every second time we audit a company against them. Today's webinar aims to raise awareness of the OFSC's excavation safety requirements and how to meet them. I'd like to introduce today's presenters to you. First, you'll be hearing from Federal Safety Officer Ralph Willson, who will outline what's required by the scheme's audit criteria for excavation. After that, we'll hear from long-time accredited builder Hindmarsh Construction about its journey with the management of excavations. From Hindmarsh today, we have National SQE Manager Dane Brown, Services Manager Andrew Connolly, and ACT SQE Manager Glenn Hobbs. We'll finish the hour with our question and answer session with all of our presenters from today. I'll now hand you over to our first presenter, Federal Safety Officer Ralph Willson.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation is intended to provide a general overview of the criteria, so the OFSC criteria, rather than be a specific training session on excavation hazards more broadly. In doing that, I'll take you through each of the individual criteria. David mentioned a couple there that are having particularly poor results with, but we'll look at each one and I'll try and give you a bit of background about each as you go through. There's 9 criteria covered. Many of you would be aware of this. You can get a lot more information about the criteria and the OFSC broader criteria using the guidelines, which is available on the website. Before we look at the specific criteria, it's important to note that the OFSC audit is not a legislative audit. Legislation is considered by the FSOs, but it's not centred just on that legislation. It adopts a more risk management focus than the legislation maybe does. Each jurisdiction obviously has its own regulations and codes of practice. They're typically based on the national framework. There are some differences. The one on the right-hand side there is the latest one out of WA, which is different to some of the others. The one in the centre, Victorian, I think has some better photos. And I stuck Queensland up because that's where I'm based today. Obviously, all jurisdictions has their own code there. And it's relevant to the criteria being reviewed, what the legislation in the particular jurisdiction is on the site that's being reviewed. The FH 7.1 is the first criteria, and it's centred around a HIRAC process. When a FSO does an audit, they're looking at the company's project risk assessments, their safe work method statements, and their other risk assessment tools that they may have. And they'll be looking at various factors like those on the screen to determine whether the risk has been identified, whether there's controls in place that are adequate. You need to particularly, though, take into consideration that the criteria does talk about the hierarchy of control here. There is a need to look at that hierarchy. If we can design out risks, we should be doing that. We shouldn't just be deferring to a minimum standard or the basic controls. This criteria is not limited by specific legislation. There is a risk of engulfment or where a worker enters a trench. Control measures should be looked at regardless of the depth. We shouldn't be having situations where a trench is 1.45 metres deep, less than the 1.5 metres, and yet the worker is required to bend over and work at the bottom of the trench in unstable or poor soils and say, look, we don't have to do anything because it's less than 1.5. This criteria requires us to use a risk assessment approach and identify what are the hazards, what are the controls that we're going to put in place. This criteria then goes on to look at particular hazards in more detail then. So the second criteria is risks associated with adjacent buildings and structures. To be successful, a company must have a system to both identify, assess, and come up with controls associated with these risks. Often this will be part of a permit system for each excavation. However, in situations like the one shown on the photo, it should also be picked up in the broader risk assessment process to ensure there's adequate controls in the overall design of the project. The intention is not to have just a tick box saying we consider, but that the system identifies the process to have the right person with the right qualifications, assess the full impact, and design controls that are relevant. The third criteria is all about services. The permit or other safe system of work that you have in place needs to cover those 3 dot points. For each excavation, it needs to identify if there's services in the immediate location that would be impacted or impact the excavation work, and look at the management of works adjacent to the services. So that's particular controls that we put in place to prevent striking those services or having negative impacts from the work adjacent to those services, and any necessary liaison with the asset owner. Probably the biggest one is that second dot point about managing work adjacent to the services and making sure that we are specifying. We're not just generally saying we've identified service, put in place generic controls, but what are the specific controls we're looking to put in place? I just threw this site up. It's a bit of a plug for the Look Up and Live app. It doesn't cover all of Australia yet, but it may be of benefit to some of you out there. A number of the asset owners have got together and put their information on an app that you might find useful in meeting the previous criteria. The app allows you to access the property details, voltage of the power lines adjacent to the project. It does also link to the asset owner's safety advice and has a direct link into Dial Before You Dig, and allows you to do things like print a plan of the project site with scales and details of the power lines and exclusion zones and etc. If you haven't come across it, it might be worth a quick look. Criteria number 4, this one looks at the method used to prevent collapse. The process must involve either a permit or a drawing or a plan to specifically look at the excavation and come up with the details and the method to prevent ground collapse. It's asking you to look at, well, what are the controls for the particular excavation that's being undertaken, not just a generic statement about we'll determine controls, but the risk assessment looks at the particular excavation. That drawing on the bottom left I threw in there often have discussions about, well, what is the depth of an excavation and how do you determine that? You must take into consideration the spoil that's taken out as well. The codes of practice also have a lot of details about the different controls that can be adopted, either the benching, battering, or combinations. And where we're using a combination, making sure that the battering starts from the finish of the benching, not the top of the cut. If we're using other sorts of controls like the photos on the right, that we get engineering advice about those controls, that engineering advice should be in writing, should be available on site, and say any conditions where the advice would change. In all cases, though, the PCBU needs to ensure the controls are designed by a suitably qualified person, for example, a geotechnical engineer. Each of the different codes of practice give you varying advice on what a competent person is. They use a generic term, but we should be looking at, well, what is the company setting as their minimum standard for a competency in designing excavation work and making sure we have processes around that. Criteria 5, this one is looking at shoring systems that David mentioned is often part of a non-compliance. Where we're allowing shoring to be a system that can be used, we've got to ensure that we have a process that makes sure it's designed by a qualified engineer, detailed and update drawings or plans. And the next one is where we often get it, installed by a competent person. So it's up to the company to determine what competency is in regards to installing a shoring. So it might be training in the particular shoring system. It could be an external or internal training course that they've done, but they have to be ensure that the system is installed by a competent person. And part of that third dot point is also that it's verified as correctly installed prior to use. So this is the concept of a handover certificate. There is some way of ensuring there's a verification process as part of that. And obviously, if we are modifying or changing the shoring system, that we get that re-signed off by a qualified engineer. I know technically trench shields and trench boxes differ from shoring. Shoring, is obviously designed to prevent a collapse, while shields and boxes are designed to protect workers if a collapse occur. But the principles of this criteria apply across from shoring and trench shields and boxes likewise. That photo shows you a terrible example where, although they had shoring, it just wasn't adequate. The work that needed to happen put the worker outside of the trench shield. That second photo was a bit of a reminder to me. We should be considering risks from even relatively shallow excavations. We can't forget that a cubic metre of soil typically weighs anywhere up to 1.6 tonnes, depending on the moisture content or type of material, and being struck or pinned by soil can be a significant risk even in relatively low depths. Criteria 6. This one's all about inspections. There's 3 parts to the criteria that you need to meet: determining what is regular within the system, specifying the minimum competency for undertaking inspections, and demonstrating the inspection confirms the controls are as per the permit or the plan or the drawing that we have in place for that particular excavation. Something that would meet the criteria would be that we have an inspection or require it to be done by an engineer or someone who's completed an excavation course that's specified, that's taken place before the working shift or after rainfall or other events that could impact the stability, that we use an inspection sheet to record that and it becomes part of the permit records. That kind of process would meet the criteria. But if we're just saying, look, excavations will be inspected as part of monthly site inspection, yet we know we've got deep excavations open and closed within the day, we're not going to be able to demonstrate the regular inspection. All of the codes have varying degree of information about what is regular and can help you in regards to designing that system. Criteria 7 is all about falls into the excavation and ensuring that they've been controlled. Don't forget we need to adopt the hierarchy of control from H1 criteria. And we also need to consider not just the workers around the excavation, so having exclusion zones, but the workers that are required to undertake the work around the excavation itself and ensuring that we have controls in place to stop them falling. Obviously, if it's over a 2 metre fall, it becomes high-risk construction work and we need a specific swim. But we should be looking for higher order controls where possible to prevent falls. Second last criteria is all about mobile plant, ensuring that we have a system to manage plant operating around excavations. Typically, this would take into consideration the zone of influence. It may need engineering advice on the loads that we're placing adjacent to trenches. We need to take that into consideration with any shoring system that we've got in place. But you'd need to be able to demonstrate you've got a system and that system's been implemented to manage the plant around the excavation. The last slide I've got is associated with the final criteria for excavation, which is that the system ensures emergency procedures are established for the excavation, not just for the project generally, but for the excavation. There's obviously a range of unexpected emergency incidents potentially involving excavation that should be considered when developing emergency procedures. These can be ground slip, engulfment, flooding, gas leaks, rescuing workers from an excavation. We have to ensure that we've got emergency procedures that take those into consideration where they're relevant for the project, and that the emergency procedures covers off on the sorts of issues that are on the screen there at the moment. As I mentioned at the start, you can get a lot more detail than what I've given you there about the criteria by looking at the audit criteria guidelines. They're available on the website where you can find a copy that broadly looks at all the criteria, but excavation as well. David, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you.
No, great overview of what the scheme criteria requires. And as Ralph mentioned, if you're after more detail on each of the individual criteria, do have a look at the scheme audit criteria available on the website www.fsc.gov.au.